On the morning of May 27th, 1940, German soldiers crouched behind disabled vehicles and makeshift cover outside the French port of Dunkirk, watching something they could not explain. 300,000 British and French soldiers were trapped on the beaches. The Wehrmacht had them surrounded. German artillery pounded the sand. Stukas screamed overhead. The British expeditionary force was finished. Every German soldier knew it. This was supposed to be the end of Britain's army. But the British were not behaving like a defeated army. German troops watched through field glasses as lines of soldiers stood waist-deep in the freezing water, waiting for hours under constant air attack. They did not scatter. They did not break. They waited in perfect discipline, while small boats ferried them to larger ships offshore. When a Stuka came in for a strafing run, they ducked, then stood back up and resumed their positions. One German officer wrote in his diary that night that he had never seen anything like it. The British were being destroyed, yet they acted as if they were merely boarding trains for a holiday. He called it disturbing. What thousands of German soldiers witnessed at Dunkirk was the beginning of a puzzle that would confuse the Wehrmacht for the next 5 years. The British soldier was not supposed to be like this. German propaganda had told them the British were soft, decadent, unwilling to fight. The reality was something else entirely. This is the story of what German soldiers really thought about the British during World War II, not the propaganda version. The truth, as documented in private letters, captured diaries, and secret recordings that the Germans never knew existed. The German military's first serious encounter with British ground forces came during the Battle of France in May 1940. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg tactics had shattered French and Belgian resistance in days. The speed of the German advance stunned even German commanders. Army Group A's panzers swept through the Ardennes, cut across northern France, and trapped the Allied armies against the English Channel. It should have been total annihilation. 300 to 38,000 Allied troops were crowded into a shrinking pocket around Dunkirk. German generals expected mass surrender. What they got instead was something that planted the first seeds of doubt about their understanding of the British character. General Heinz Guderian, commander of the 19th Panzer Corps, later wrote about the fighting around Dunkirk with a tone of frustrated respect. The British rearguard actions, particularly by units like the 2nd Battalion Coldstream Guards and the Welsh Guards at Boulogne and Calais, bought precious time for the evacuation. These units knew they were being sacrificed. They fought anyway. At Calais, Brigadier Claude Nicholson received orders to hold the port. Churchill's telegram was unambiguous. Evacuation will not repeat, not take place. Nicholson's garrison of roughly 4,000 troops held out for 4 days against overwhelming German forces, tying down the 10th Panzer Division. When Nicholson finally surrendered on May 26th, his force had been shattered. Churchill later told Parliament that only 30 unwounded survivors were evacuated. German soldiers who fought at Calais reported something unexpected in their letters home. They wrote about the stubbornness of the British defence, the refusal to surrender even when the situation was hopeless. One German sergeant noted that clearing the old town took 3 times longer than expected because the British fought from house to house, room to room, even when completely surrounded. The cost to both sides was severe. German casualties at Calais exceeded expectations. More importantly, the delay disrupted the German timetable. Every hour the British held was an hour the forces at Dunkirk could use to organize their escape. Similar actions occurred along the entire perimeter. At Arras on May 21st, British tanks counterattacked the advancing German columns. The attack was small-scale, involving only 74 tanks, but it caught the Germans off guard. For several hours, German commanders believed they faced a major British offensive. Rommel himself commanded the 7th Panzer Division during the Arras counterattack. He later wrote that it was the most critical moment of the entire French campaign. His division suffered significant casualties before the British attack was contained. The psychological impact on German commanders was significant. If the British could launch counterattacks even while being encircled, what else might they do? The caution that led to Hitler's halt order stemmed partly from respect for British fighting capability demonstrated at Arras. This was not what German training manuals had predicted. The British were supposed to be poorly led and quick to break under pressure. Instead, They were tenacious beyond reason. The evacuation itself became legendary. Between May 26th and June 4th, over 338,000 Allied soldiers escaped across the English Channel. Nearly 700 civilian vessels joined the rescue fleet. German commanders watched in disbelief as their certain victory slipped away across 21 miles of water. Hitler's halt order, issued on May 24th, remains controversial to this day. For 3 critical days, German panzer divisions were held back from finishing off the trapped armies. The reasons are still debated. What is certain is that those 3 days allowed the British to establish a defensive perimeter and begin the evacuation that saved their army. German soldiers who witnessed the evacuation developed a grudging respect mixed with confusion. They had won the battle. They had driven the British off the continent, yet somehow it did not feel like total victory. The British had escaped, and they had escaped in good order. A German war correspondent wrote that watching the last ships leave Dunkirk was like watching a wounded animal escape into the forest. You knew you had hurt it badly, but you also knew it would be back. He was right. The psychological impact of Dunkirk on German soldiers deserves attention. They had expected total victory. They had achieved military victory, but the escape of more than 300,000 Allied troops meant that Britain still had an army. The island fortress across the Channel remained undefeated. German soldiers who wrote home in the summer of 1940 often expressed puzzlement at British behaviour. They had been told that Britain would seek peace once France fell. Instead, Churchill's defiant speeches reached German ears through intercepted radio broadcasts. The British were not surrendering. They were preparing to fight on. One German NCO wrote to his brother that the English were either very brave or very stupid, perhaps both. They had lost everything on the continent. Their army had abandoned its equipment, yet they acted as if they had won something. He could not understand it. This failure to understand British determination would haunt German strategy for the rest of the war. Hitler's peace offers were rejected. The Battle of Britain was lost. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of England, was postponed indefinitely. The British simply refused to accept that they were beaten. German soldiers began to revise their opinions. The propaganda image of soft, decadent Englishmen did not match the reality of an enemy who had been knocked down at Dunkirk and come up fighting. Something in the British character defied German expectations. The true test of German respect for British soldiers came in the North African desert. Beginning in February 1941, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and his Afrika Korps engaged in a 2-year campaign against the British Eighth Army that would produce some of the most candid German assessments of their enemy. Rommel himself left detailed opinions about his opponents. In letters to his wife and in his military papers, he described British soldiers with a mixture of admiration and criticism that revealed far more nuance than German propaganda allowed. He wrote that the Guards Brigade was almost a living embodiment of the virtues and faults of the British soldier. Tremendous courage and tenacity combined with a rigid lack of mobility. This was high praise from a commander who valued mobile warfare above all else. He was saying the British would stand and fight to the death, but were slow to adapt to changing circumstances. The original desert rats of the 7th Armoured Division earned Rommel's particular respect. He noted that the division was battle-hardened and dangerous, with crews who knew the desert intimately. They had been fighting since 1940 and knew every tactic in the book. But Rommel's most telling comment concerned British commanders rather than their soldiers. He believed British troops were lions led by donkeys. The individual soldier was brave, skilled, and determined. The generals were overly cautious, slow to react, and bound by doctrine that often failed to match the fluid reality of desert warfare. This assessment was shared by many German officers. They respected the fighting quality of British troops while criticizing the command structure that often wasted that quality. One German intelligence officer noted that British soldiers would hold impossible positions with suicidal courage, then be ordered to withdraw just as they were about to be relieved. The siege of Tobruk in 1941 became a symbol of this dynamic. Australian and British troops held the Libyan port for 241 days against repeated German and Italian assaults. German propaganda dismissed the defenders as rats trapped in a hole. The defenders adopted the name proudly, calling themselves the Rats of Tobruk. German soldiers who fought at Tobruk told a different story than the propaganda. In private correspondence, they described the defenders as fanatics who refused to accept that their position was untenable. One German officer wrote that attacking Tobruk was like attacking a wall made of bayonets. Every assault cost more than it gained. The garrison at Tobruk included Australians, British, Indian, and Polish troops. They held out under constant bombardment, short of food, water, and ammunition. German commanders tried everything to break them. Infantry assaults failed. Tank attacks failed. Even combined arms operations that had shattered the French army made no impression on Tobruk's defences. Rommel became increasingly frustrated. He needed the port to supply his advance into Egypt. Without Tobruk, his logistics chain stretched back to Tripoli, over 1,000 miles of desert roads constantly harassed by British aircraft. The stubborn garrison was bleeding his army dry. German after-action reports from Tobruk reveal grudging admiration. The defenders had done everything wrong according to German doctrine. They were isolated, outnumbered, cut off from reinforcement. They should have surrendered. Instead, they turned their position into a fortress and dared the Germans to take it. The British relieved Tobruk in December 1941 during Operation Crusader. By then, the garrison had become legendary on both sides. German soldiers who had failed to take the port never forgot the experience. This was the peculiar nature of the Desert War. German soldiers often referred to it as a clean war, fought by professionals on both sides without the ideological hatred that characterized the Eastern Front. Prisoners were generally treated well. Rommel personally insisted on humane treatment for captured British soldiers, and he expected the same in return. The desert environment itself shaped how soldiers viewed each other. Both sides endured the same brutal conditions, temperatures that reached 50 degrees Celsius during the day and dropped to freezing at night, sandstorms that blinded men and wrecked equipment, water shortages that made every drop precious, disease that claimed as many casualties as combat. In this shared misery, a strange understanding developed between enemies. German soldiers wrote about watching British positions through binoculars and seeing men who looked just like them, suffering just like them, fighting for causes neither fully understood. The back-and-forth nature of the desert campaign reinforced this perception. The same ground was captured and lost repeatedly. German soldiers who advanced over British positions one month might find themselves defending those same positions the next. They saw the graves of British soldiers killed in earlier fighting. They read the letters and diaries left behind in abandoned camps. One German officer wrote that reading a dead Englishman's letter to his wife made him realize they were fighting men exactly like themselves. Husbands, fathers, sons, men who wanted to go home to families they might never see again. One documented incident illustrates this mutual respect. When Italian troops allegedly stole watches and valuables from British prisoners, Rommel ordered the items returned immediately. British prisoners who served under Rommel's command later testified that they were treated correctly, even courteously. This was not universal, of course. War is never clean. But the German perception of British soldiers in North Africa was coloured by these interactions. They saw an enemy they could respect, an enemy who fought hard but fairly. The respect was reciprocal. British commander Claude Auchinleck became so concerned about the mythical status Rommel had achieved among his own troops that he issued a remarkable directive to his officers in 1942. He wrote that there existed a real danger that their friend Rommel was becoming a kind of magician or bogeyman to their troops, who were talking far too much about him. He wished them to dispel by all possible means the idea that Rommel represented something more than an ordinary German general. That Auchinleck had to issue such an order speaks volumes about how the British viewed their German opponent, and Rommel's reputation among his own troops was equally strong in the other direction. The turning point came at El Alamein in October 1942. Montgomery had amassed overwhelming force, over 1,000 tanks against fewer than 500 German and Italian, over 1,000 artillery pieces, complete air superiority. The British 8th Army outnumbered the Afrika Corps in every category that mattered. German soldiers who survived El Alamein described the British bombardment as unlike anything they had experienced. Over 1,000 guns opened fire simultaneously on the night of October 23rd. The sound was deafening. The ground shook for miles. German positions were systematically destroyed by artillery that seemed to have unlimited ammunition. The battle lasted 12 days. German counterattacks were broken up by British artillery and air power before they could reach their objectives. Rommel, who had been on sick leave in Germany when the battle began, returned to find his army being destroyed. He ordered a retreat, but Hitler countermanded the order, demanding that German forces hold to the last man. The result was catastrophic. By the time Hitler relented, the Afrika Korps had lost half its strength. The retreat that followed would end only in Tunisia, where the last Axis forces in Africa surrendered in May 1943. German veterans of El Alamein spoke of the battle with a mixture of respect and bitterness. They respected the professionalism of the British attack. They resented the material superiority that made their own courage irrelevant. One veteran said that, at El Alamein, the British finally fought the way they should have fought all along, with everything they had. What the Germans truly thought about the British emerged most clearly in conversations they never intended anyone to hear. Beginning in 1942, British military intelligence established a network of secret listening posts at several locations around London. The most important was Trent Park, a stately mansion in North London that had once belonged to Sir Philip Sassoon, a wealthy businessman and politician. Trent Park became home to captured German generals and senior officers. They were treated with remarkable luxury. Private rooms, billiards, excellent food, walks in the gardens. A fake Scottish aristocrat named Lord Aberfeldy, actually an intelligence officer named Ian Munro, served as their welfare officer. He told the generals that King George VI himself had ordered that they be treated according to their status. The Germans believed they were being held in a gentleman's club. They relaxed. They talked freely with each other about everything, including their honest assessments of their enemies. They did not know that every room was bugged. Every light fixture, every fireplace, every plant pot contained hidden microphones. Even the trees in the garden were wired. German Jewish refugees, many of whom had fled Nazi persecution, worked in basement rooms recording and transcribing every word. Winston Churchill himself recognized the value of this intelligence operation. He wrote that the records of conversations between enemy prisoners of war afforded an excellent insight into the German character and the results of the Nazi regime. The irony was profound. Jewish refugees who had escaped Nazi Germany were now listening to Nazi generals discuss atrocities, military secrets, and their opinions of the war. These secret listeners maintained their composure while recording conversations about the persecution of their own people. Their courage matched that of any soldier on the battlefield. The intelligence gathered at Trent Park proved vital to the Allied war effort. Conversations between generals revealed German knowledge of the V-1 and V-2 rocket programs. This information led to the Allied bombing raid on Peenemünde in August 1943, which set back German rocket development by months. But beyond military intelligence, the recordings captured something else: the honest opinions of German officers about their enemies. These conversations were never meant for anyone outside the room. They represent the closest thing to truth we have about what German commanders really thought. The conversations captured at Trent Park provide the most honest German assessments of British soldiers ever recorded. These were not official reports sanitized for superiors. These were private conversations between comrades who believed no one was listening. General Wilhelm von Thoma, captured in North Africa in November 1942, discussed British forces at length with his fellow prisoners. He described British soldiers as competent, professional, but overly methodical. He noted they rarely attacked without overwhelming superiority, suggesting they were careful with their men's lives. General Ludwig Cruwell, also captured in North Africa, spoke about the tenacity of British defence. He told fellow prisoners that once the British dug in, moving them required unacceptable casualties. Their artillery was particularly effective, he said. They knew how to use it. But the most revealing conversations came when the generals discussed their overall impressions. One recurring theme was surprise at British resilience. German officers had expected Britain to seek peace after the fall of France. The decision to fight on alone seemed irrational to them. One general admitted he had underestimated British determination. Another theme was respect for certain units. The Guards regiments were mentioned repeatedly. The Long-Range Desert Group and Special Air Service earned particular attention after their operations caused significant damage behind German lines. One general called them a pain that would not go away. The conversations also revealed genuine confusion about British motivation. German officers struggled to understand why British soldiers fought so hard for an empire they believed was already lost. One prisoner speculated that it was pride. Another suggested stubbornness was simply bred into them. Perhaps the most significant admission came from a general who said that when they first invaded Russia, many German officers hoped the Western Allies would eventually join them against the Soviets. They saw the British as culturally similar, potential allies in a future European order. The fact that Britain chose to ally with Stalin rather than make peace with Hitler genuinely baffled some German commanders. These recordings, totaling roughly 150,000 pages of transcripts, remained classified for decades. They provide an unfiltered view into German military thinking that official documents could never match. If Trent Park revealed what German generals thought of conventional British forces, the commando raids revealed something else entirely. Fear. British commando operations began in June 1940, just weeks after the Dunkirk evacuation. Winston Churchill had ordered the formation of special raiding forces to strike at German-occupied Europe to prove that Britain was still in the fight. The early raids were small-scale, pinprick attacks on coastal installations in Norway and France, reconnaissance missions to gather intelligence. They accomplished little of strategic value, but they accomplished something else that the British had not anticipated. They got under Hitler's skin. The Führer's rage at commando operations was deeply personal. He saw himself as the supreme warlord of a new European order, and these small teams of British raiders made his Atlantic wall look porous. German garrisons across occupied Europe were forced to increase security, diverting troops that could have been used elsewhere. The raids grew bolder as British experience accumulated. In March 1941, Commandos struck the Lofoten Islands in Norway, destroying fish oil factories and capturing Enigma rotors that proved valuable to the codebreakers at Bletchley Park. In December 1941, they raided Vagsø, killing over 150 German soldiers and sinking 10 vessels. Each raid taught the British something new about amphibious operations. They learned what worked against German coastal defenses. They learned the importance of surprise, speed, and overwhelming violence at the point of contact. The failures were expensive, but the lessons would prove invaluable when the time came to invade the continent. Hitler responded to the raids with increasing fury. He ordered the fortification of the entire European coastline from Norway to Spain. 15,000 bunkers were to be built, manned by 300,000 troops. The Atlantic Wall, as it came to be known, was a direct response to British commando activity. But the wall could not be everywhere at once, and the commandos kept coming. In July 1941, Lieutenant David Stirling formed the Special Air Service in Egypt. Operating behind Rommel's lines, small teams of SAS troopers destroyed between 250 and 400 German and Italian aircraft during the North African campaign. They attacked airfields, supply dumps, and communication lines with seeming impunity. The British press dubbed Stirling the Phantom Major. German forces placed a significant bounty on his head and spent disproportionate resources trying to catch or kill SAS teams that numbered in the dozens. The SAS tactics were simple but effective. Small teams of 4 to 6 men would infiltrate enemy airfields at night, plant explosive charges on parked aircraft, and escape before dawn. On a single raid in December 1941, Stirling's men destroyed 24 aircraft at Egedabia airfield. Similar raids followed in rapid succession. German commanders struggled to respond. Airfield security was increased, but the SAS adapted. They attacked supply convoys instead. When convoy security improved, they went back to airfields. The constant pressure forced the Germans to divert thousands of troops to defensive duties. Hitler ordered the creation of a special unit to hunt the SAS. 500 German paratroopers were trained specifically to track and eliminate Stirling's raiders. It did not work. The desert was too vast, and the SAS knew it too well. Stirling was finally captured in January 1943 during a reconnaissance mission in Tunisia. The Germans were so concerned about his escape that they transferred him to Colditz Castle. the maximum security prison for persistent escapers. His capture did not end SAS operations. Under new leadership, the regiment continued to expand and would play a significant role in the D-Day invasion and subsequent campaigns. The long-range desert group caused similar problems. Traveling in heavily armed trucks modified for desert warfare, LRDG patrols penetrated hundreds of miles behind enemy lines on intelligence gathering and raiding missions. German commanders could never be sure where they might appear next. The LRDG had been formed in July 1940 by Major Ralph Bagnold, a pre-war desert explorer who understood the Sahara better than most men alive. His patrols could navigate across featureless sand seas that German and Italian forces considered impassable. These patrols provided critical intelligence about Axis movements, supply routes, and defensive positions. The information they gathered helped British commanders plan operations with unprecedented accuracy. They also served as transport for SAS raiding parties, earning the nickname Libyan Desert Taxi Service. One LRDG patrol made a 1,700-mile round trip behind enemy lines, spending weeks in enemy territory without detection. Such operations seemed impossible to German commanders accustomed to conventional warfare. German attempts to interdict LRDG patrols consistently failed. The desert was simply too vast. A patrol that knew the terrain could disappear into the wilderness and emerge hundreds of miles away. German aircraft searching for them found only empty sand. One German officer's diary captured the frustration. He wrote that the desert raiders were like ghosts. You could never catch them. You could only find the damage they left behind. The commando threat reached a peak in 1942. On March 28th, British commandos attacked the dry dock at St. Nazaire, the only facility on the Atlantic coast capable of servicing the German battleship Tirpitz. They rammed an explosive-laden destroyer into the dock gates. The resulting explosion destroyed the facility for the rest of the war. St. Nazaire was a spectacular success, but it was followed by disaster. On August 19, 1942, over 6,000 Allied troops, mostly Canadian, landed at the French port of Dieppe. The raid was intended to test German coastal defenses and gather intelligence. It was a catastrophe. German defenders slaughtered the attackers on the beaches. Nearly 900 Canadians were killed. Over 2,000 were captured. The Allies lost 106 aircraft. But even in victory, the Germans learned something troubling. A copy of the Canadian operational orders was found on the beach. Among the instructions was a directive to bind prisoners. Bodies of German soldiers were found with their hands tied. Whether this represented actual misconduct or simply practical security measures during a raid remains debated. What is not debated is Hitler's reaction. He was apoplectic. On October 18, 1942, Hitler issued the Commando Order. It stated that all Allied commandos captured in Europe or Africa were to be annihilated to the last man. This applied whether they were in uniform or not, whether fighting or attempting to surrender. No quarter was to be given. The order was a war crime. The Nuremberg Tribunal would later rule it a direct violation of the laws of war. German officers who carried out executions under the Commando Order were convicted and hanged. But the order revealed something important about German perception of British special forces. Hitler felt compelled to issue death sentences for captured commandos because normal methods had failed to deter them. The raids continued despite all German efforts. British special forces had become a psychological weapon as much as a military one. Not all German commanders obeyed the order. Rommel refused to implement it in North Africa. He continued to treat captured commandos as prisoners of war. Other commanders followed the order with enthusiasm. The result was that captured British commandos faced a lottery of survival depending on who captured them. The British knew about the Commando Order. They trained their men to remove identifying badges and berets if capture seemed imminent. They established procedures for claiming to be regular soldiers rather than special forces. It did not always work. Between 1942 and 1945, dozens of British, American, and other Allied commandos were executed under Hitler's order. Their deaths were kept secret. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves. The Germans hoped this would remain hidden. It did not. After the war, British investigators traced the fates of missing commandos with remarkable persistence. They found witnesses, uncovered graves, and brought perpetrators to justice. The executions became evidence of how seriously the Germans took the commando threat and how far they were willing to go to eliminate it. The first victims of the commando order were 7 British commandos captured after Operation Muscatoon, a raid on a Norwegian hydroelectric plant. They were shot on October 23, 1942, just 5 days after the order was issued. Over the following 3 years, dozens more were executed. In July 1944, 34 SAS prisoners were killed after Operation Bullbasket in France. In late November 1944, another 31 died after Operation Leuthen. Each execution was carried out in secret. Each body was buried without identification. Some German commanders refused to implement the order. Rommel in Afrika and certain Wehrmacht officers in Western Europe treated captured commandos as prisoners of war despite Hitler's directive. They considered the order illegal and chose to ignore it. Others implemented the order with enthusiasm. SS units in particular were eager to execute captured commandos. The line between lawful combatants and criminal murderers often depended on which German unit made the capture. British soldiers were aware of the commando order. It was mentioned in briefings before operations. Men going behind enemy lines knew that capture might mean death. They went anyway. This knowledge affected how commandos fought. Surrender was not an attractive option when it might lead to execution. Better to fight to the last or escape. The order may have made German security forces feel better, but it also made British special forces more dangerous. The Nuremberg trials after the war specifically addressed the commando order. It was ruled a crime against humanity. German officers who had ordered or participated in executions under the order were convicted and punished. Some were hanged. The German opinion of British soldiers evolved throughout the war, but certain themes remained constant. German veterans who were interviewed decades after the war often said the same things. British soldiers were tough in defense. They were stubborn. They did not panic under fire. Their artillery was excellent. Their air support, especially later in the war, was overwhelming, but the criticisms also remained consistent. British commanders were too cautious. They moved too slowly. They would not take risks. A German officer could predict what the British would do because they always did the same thing. One German veteran, interviewed in the 1980s, described British forces as competent professionals with a disposition to overwhelming force. If there was something he respected about them, it was that they took care of their men. They would not attack until they had everything they needed to succeed. He compared this to American forces, whom he described as enthusiastic amateurs, with a disposition to aggression he had never seen in any other nation's sons. Americans attacked whether they were ready or not. They learned fast, but they learned by dying. Soviet forces were different again. Germans who fought in the East described the Russians with a mixture of fear and grudging respect that differed entirely from their views of Western opponents. The Eastern Front was ideological warfare. The Western Front, at least in German perception, was war between civilized opponents. This distinction mattered. German soldiers who had the choice universally preferred to surrender to British or American forces rather than Soviet ones. They believed, correctly in most cases, that they would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. The brutal warfare of the Eastern Front had no equivalent in the West. The D-Day landings of June 6, 1944, provided the final major German assessment of British military capability. The invasion caught German commanders off guard, despite years of preparation. Allied deception operations had convinced the German High Command that the main invasion would come at Calais. When British, American, and Canadian forces landed in Normandy, crucial German reserves remained hundreds of miles away. The German forces in Normandy on D-Day were a mixed bag. Some were elite units, like the 21st Panzer Division. Others were occupation troops of limited combat value, including so-called Eastern battalions, made up of former Soviet prisoners who had chosen service in the Wehrmacht over starvation in prison camps. The British landed on 2 beaches, Gold and Sword. Canadian forces landed at Juno. By the end of the first day, all 3 beachheads were secure. The British had pushed several miles inland, despite fierce German resistance. German soldiers who survived D-Day described the experience as overwhelming. The sheer volume of Allied firepower, from naval guns to aircraft to artillery, was unlike anything they had experienced. One veteran said it was like fighting against a factory. The Allies simply had more of everything, but German accounts also noted British professionalism. The invasion was executed with precision that impressed even its victims. Landing craft arrived on schedule. Troops moved off the beaches in good order. Objectives were taken according to plan. This was not the British Army of 1940. This was a machine refined by 4 years of war. Field Marshal von Rundstedt's report on the invasion, written in the days following D-Day, provides insight into German thinking. He noted the skillful and large-scale employment of enemy airborne troops. He described the flexible and well-directed support of land troops by naval artillery. He remarked on how precisely the invasion force had rehearsed their assault. But von Rundstedt also noted the quality of the German soldier and his unqualified will to fight to the last. German forces inflicted heavy casualties on the invaders, even while being defeated. The battle for Normandy would take 3 months and cost both sides dearly. German soldiers in Normandy faced a different British army than the one evacuated from Dunkirk 4 years earlier. This army had tanks, artillery, air support, and most importantly, experience. The desert veterans of the 8th Army formed the core of many units. They knew how to fight Germans. They had been doing it since 1940. German accounts of the Normandy fighting describe stubborn British resistance in the hedgerow country around Caen. The city was liberated in stages, with northern Cayenne falling on July 9th and the southern districts following by July 21st, more than 6 weeks after D-Day. German counterattacks repeatedly stalled against British defensive positions that could absorb punishment and keep fighting. The fighting around Caen was among the bloodiest of the Normandy campaign. British forces faced the bulk of German armour, including elite SS Panzer divisions. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, composed of fanatical young soldiers, fought with desperate intensity against British and Canadian units. German accounts describe the fighting as brutal but professional. British artillery was particularly effective, breaking up German counterattacks before they could develop momentum. Tank engagements were frequent and costly to both sides. One German tank commander wrote that fighting British armour was different from fighting the Soviets. The British did not throw tanks away in reckless charges. They used combined arms tactics, infantry supporting armour, artillery supporting both. Each attack was methodical, designed to minimize losses while maximizing effect. Operation Goodwood in July 1944 exemplified this approach. British armoured divisions attacked south from Caen in a massive operation designed to break through German defences. The attack gained ground but did not achieve a breakthrough. German anti-tank guns and dug-in tanks inflicted heavy losses on the advancing British armour. German commanders interpreted Goodwood as confirmation of their assessment. The British had material superiority, but lacked the willingness to accept casualties necessary for a decisive breakthrough. They would grind forward slowly, accepting a longer campaign in exchange for fewer losses. From a German perspective, this was frustrating. They knew they could not match Allied material strength. Their only hope was to inflict casualties so severe that the Allies would seek a negotiated peace. British caution made this impossible. The war of attrition favoured the side with more resources. The Typhoon fighter bombers terrified German soldiers. Any movement during daylight invited attack from the air. German veterans called them Jabos, shortened from Jagdbomber. They described them as the most feared weapon they faced, more dangerous than tanks or artillery, because they could find you anywhere. By August, the German position in Normandy had collapsed. The encirclement at Falaise trapped tens of thousands of German soldiers. Those who escaped described nightmarish scenes of carnage as Allied aircraft destroyed the retreating columns. German officers captured during the Normandy campaign told their British interrogators that they had been surprised by the intensity of British resistance during the counterattacks around Caen. They had expected easier progress. They encountered instead an enemy that had learned from 4 years of war and was determined not to give ground. After the war ended in May 1945, German veterans scattered across occupied Germany. Many were held in prisoner-of-war camps for months or years. Others returned to destroyed cities and shattered families. The Wehrmacht that had conquered Europe was broken. In the decades that followed, German veterans were often asked about their wartime opponents. Their answers, recorded in oral histories and memoirs, provide a final perspective on the German view of British soldiers. The consensus, repeated across hundreds of accounts, was consistent. British soldiers were professional, disciplined, and tough. They fought clean for the most part. They treated prisoners correctly. Their individual skill was high. Their courage was not in question. The criticism was equally consistent. British leadership was too cautious. British tactics were too predictable. The British would not take risks when risks were necessary. They won through material superiority rather than operational brilliance. This assessment contains obvious bias. German veterans had reason to explain their defeat as the result of enemy resources rather than enemy skill, but the consistency of the responses suggests genuine belief rather than post-war rationalization. Many German veterans distinguished between British enlisted men and British officers. The common soldier was praised for courage and skill. The officer class received more criticism. German veterans believed British officers were too reliant on doctrine, too slow to adapt to changing circumstances, too cautious when boldness was required. This perception had some basis in reality. British military culture emphasized careful planning and overwhelming force. Commanders who took risks and failed faced severe consequences. Commanders who moved slowly and succeeded received advancement. The system rewarded caution. Rommel exploited this tendency repeatedly. He would launch attacks that British commanders considered impossible, catching their forces off balance. By the time British generals responded, the situation had changed. Rommel's advantage was not in men or material, but in speed of decision. German veterans also noted British dependence on logistics. The British Army travelled with enormous quantities of supplies, equipment, and support personnel. This made British forces powerful but inflexible. They could not match German mobility because they could not abandon their supply trains. In the desert, this difference was critical. German units could advance hundreds of miles on minimal supplies. British units required carefully planned logistics before any major operation. The difference in operational tempo often favoured the Germans, despite their material disadvantage. One German veteran put it simply. He said, "The British soldier was the best enemy they could have asked for. He fought hard, but fair. He was respected. He could be hated in the moment of battle, but not afterward." Field Marshal Erwin Rommel never lived to give his final assessment of his British opponents. On October 14, 1944, he was forced to take poison after being implicated in the plot to assassinate Hitler. He died believing the war was lost and that Germany had brought catastrophe upon itself. But Rommel left behind his papers and letters, published after the war as the Rommel Papers. In them, he revealed an adversary he respected far more than he could say publicly. He wrote of British courage, British tenacity, British professionalism. He also wrote of British faults. But his overall tone was one of professional admiration for an enemy who had beaten him. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who defeated Rommel at El Alamein, rarely mentioned his German opponent by name in his own writings. He referred to him simply as the enemy commander. Some historians interpret this as professional detachment. Others see it as reluctance to elevate his opponent. What is certain is that the two men who faced each other across the North African desert became symbols of their respective armies. Rommel represented the German way of war, mobile, aggressive, and risk-taking. Montgomery represented the British approach, careful, methodical, and overwhelming. The mutual respect between German and British soldiers extended beyond the generals. Private soldiers on both sides often spoke well of their opponents after the war. German prisoners in British camps were generally treated correctly. British prisoners in German hands, at least in the Western theatre, received similar treatment. This stood in stark contrast to the Eastern Front. German soldiers who fought the Soviets described a completely different war, one without rules or mercy. The British were seen as civilized opponents who shared European values. The distinction shaped how German soldiers fought in the West versus the East. Some German veterans maintained correspondence with British counterparts after the war. Regimental associations held joint reunions. Former enemies met at battlefields where they had once tried to kill each other. This was possible because both sides believed they had fought with honor. The war graves tell the story. German and British cemeteries in North Africa, in Italy, in France sit close to each other. Sometimes the headstones are only meters apart, enemies in life, neighbors in death. The German soldiers who survived the war went home to rebuild their country. The British soldiers did the same. For both sides, the war became memory, then history, then legend. But in the archives, in the letters and diaries and secret recordings, the honest assessments survive. German soldiers respected their British opponents. They criticized them too. They feared some of them, particularly the Commandos and Special Forces, who struck without warning and vanished without trace. Above all, they saw in the British soldier something they understood, a professional doing a job, an enemy they could fight without hatred, a warrior whose courage matched their own. The Trent Park recordings offer perhaps the most valuable insight. Here were German generals speaking freely to each other, unaware that every word was being recorded. They had no reason to lie or exaggerate. What they said represented genuine belief, and what they said was largely positive. British soldiers were brave. British artillery was excellent. British logistics were formidable. The criticisms, when they came, focused on leadership rather than fighting men. One recorded conversation stands out. Two German generals discussed what they would do differently if they could fight the British again. Both agreed that underestimating British determination had been a critical error. Both believed the British soldier was as good as any in the world when properly led. This was not propaganda. This was not public relations. This was two professional soldiers honestly assessing an opponent they had fought for years. Their conclusion was clear. The British deserved respect. When the last German veteran of World War II dies, and when the last British veteran follows him, these assessments will remain, recorded on paper and tape, and in the memories of those who heard them firsthand. The German opinion of British soldiers was never simple. It was respect mixed with criticism, admiration mixed with frustration, fear mixed with something approaching professional camaraderie. It was the opinion soldiers form of enemies they have fought for years and come to know better than their own countrymen. Professor Soenke Neitzel, who spent years studying the Trent Park transcripts and other German prisoner recordings, revealed that German soldiers operated within their own frame of reference, one where violence became normalized but professional standards still mattered. The German soldier judged his British counterpart by the standards of that frame. Could he fight? Would he stand? Did he treat prisoners correctly? Did he follow the rules of war? On these measures, the British passed. German veterans who lived into the 21st century often expressed similar views when interviewed. They spoke of the British with a respect they rarely extended to other opponents. The British, they said, were soldiers like themselves. This assessment may surprise those who expect wartime enemies to hate each other. But soldiers often develop a respect for opponents who demonstrate courage and skill. The hatred is reserved for those who fight dirty, who abuse prisoners, who target civilians. The British, in German eyes, did none of these things. The historical record supports this perception. British treatment of German prisoners was generally correct. British forces did not engage in the systematic atrocities that characterized the Eastern Front. The war in the West was brutal, but it operated within limits that both sides recognized. German soldiers sensed this difference. They fought hard against the British because they had to, but they did not fight with the desperate fury that characterized the war against the Soviets. They knew that surrender to British forces meant imprisonment, not execution. This knowledge shaped German behavior in the final months of the war. As the Reich collapsed, German units fled westward, seeking to surrender to British or American forces rather than fall into Soviet hands. Entire armies abandoned their positions on the Eastern Front to race toward the Western Allies. The preference was rational. German soldiers who surrendered to British forces lived to see their families again. Those who surrendered to the Soviets often did not. The British soldiers who accepted those surrenders generally treated their prisoners correctly. They followed the Geneva Convention. They provided food, water, and medical care. They behaved as professionals dealing with defeated professionals. This behavior reinforced everything the German soldier had come to believe about his British opponent. Tough in battle, fair in victory, an enemy worthy of respect. The story of German perceptions matters because it reminds us that war is fought by human beings. Men who fear, who suffer, who die. Men who form opinions about their enemies based on direct experience, rather than propaganda. German soldiers went into the war believing British troops would be easy opponents. They emerged from the war knowing better. The British were tough, professional, and determined. They could be beaten in battle, but they would not stay beaten. They came back. From Dunkirk to El Alamein to D-Day, the British soldier proved himself in German eyes, not as a superman, not as invincible, but as a worthy opponent who earned respect through courage and endurance. The recordings from Trent Park, the letters and diaries from the front, the testimonies of veterans decades later all tell the same story. German soldiers respected the British. They criticized British leadership. They feared British commandos. But they never despised the British soldier the way propaganda told them to. That respect was earned on battlefields across 3 continents. It was earned by young men who stood in freezing water at Dunkirk waiting for boats that might never come, by soldiers who held Tobruk against siege for 241 days, by commandos who struck behind enemy lines knowing capture meant death, by infantrymen who stormed the beaches of Normandy into the teeth of German defences. The German soldier saw all of this. He formed his opinions based on what he saw, and those opinions, recorded in thousands of documents that survive to this day, tell us something important about the nature of war and the nature of respect. You cannot respect an enemy you have not fought. You cannot understand an enemy you have not seen. The German soldier fought the British for 5 years across deserts, mountains, beaches, and hedgerows. He came to know his enemy, and knowing his enemy, he respected him. That respect endures in the historical record. It endures in the archives where researchers continue to discover new evidence of how German soldiers viewed their British opponents. And that evidence is clear. The British were respected. The British were feared. The British, for all their faults and failures, fought a war that earned the acknowledgement of their enemies. That is perhaps the highest compliment any soldier can receive. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for keeping these stories alive.